Good evening and welcome to the 8th Van Hasselt Lecture. A special welcome to the Consul General of Turkey, Mrs. Sevgi Kizakic. I'm Hans Hellendoorn and it is an honor to be here today as Vice Rector Magnificus of TU Delft. The annual Van Hasselt Lecture is hosted by Studium Generale, TU Delft, together with the Department of Values, Technology and Innovation of our Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. Today, we gather to remember a moment that shaped the history of our university and to reflect on what it means for us now. Let me take you back to a gold grey morning in November 1940, 85 years ago, almost to the day. Hundreds of students had come to the civil engineering building to hear the farewell lecture of Professor Josephus Jitta, a beloved teacher. The Nazis had banned Jewish professors from Dutch universities, and this was to be his last day. But when students arrived, they found only a note on the door: the lecture was cancelled. In that tense silence, one student took a stand. Frans van Hasselt climbed the grand stairs and spoke out against this injustice. Even though his friends warned him, it was dangerous. His words echoed what many felt, and they sparked the first student strike against the Nazi regime in the Netherlands. Frans paid the ultimate price. Arrested later that year, he died in Buchenwald in 1942 at the age of 29. He never saw himself as a hero, but he had the courage to act when it mattered most. Why do we remember him today? Because moral choices are not just part of our history, they are part of our future. Our students will work on technologies that can change lives, sometimes in places where laws and ethics are fragile. At TU Delft, we believe it is vital to think about human dignity, responsibility, and the impact of our work. Technology is never an end in itself. It is a means to serve people and to make the world a better place. That is why we hold the Frans van Hasselt Lecture, to honor his courage and to remind ourselves that the future needs us today. But how can we emulate this resolve today? Van Hasselt had the determination of his convictions. I must admit that I find myself struggling every now and then again. We live in uncertain times. The geopolitical situation is volatile and conflicts abound. There is the war between Russia and Ukraine and the Israel-Palestine conflict, civil war in Sudan and in Myanmar, and ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The list goes on. People are displaced through war and climate change and resource scarcity. And while, thankfully, we are still living in times of peace here in the Netherlands, misinformation and polarization are some of the forces we have to deal with. And so when we say we want to create impact for a better, a more sustainable society, we run up against inevitable questions. Do we educate the world, share our knowledge freely and openly? Do we safeguard our results to protect our own interests? And where do we locate this society? Does it stop at the national borders or at the European level? And how about that myriad of challenges covered under the heading of dual use, with lines blurring as technology advances? Can we still claim that we develop on our campus, that what we develop on our campus is always used to the good? Moreover, on our campus, with people with over 100 different nationalities, how do we avoid taking sides? And where do we draw the line between freedom of speech and harassment? Can we facilitate peaceful protest while also making everybody feel safe and heard? Dilemmas I had not considered to be encountering when I joined this university more than a quarter of a century ago. Just to illustrate this, back then, I was, proudly connected to the fossil fuel industry, while anything defense-related was discussed with the utmost circumspection. How times have changed. Of course, we are a learning organization, and although we don't always have all the answers right at hand, we do know how to work through knotty problems by looking at them from all sides and discussing all aspects. We have created a framework to work through and weigh up sensitive subjects, ranging from the fossil fuel debate to data security to political sensitive international collaborations. I discussed it today with the Student Council. This is how, one decision at a time, we move with the times, calibrating our moral compass as we go along. And what if we find the decision particularly difficult? Perhaps we should occasionally think back and draw inspiration from Frans van Hasselt, who never wavered, but stood up for what he thought was right. Now, before we move to our keynote speaker, there are 2 points. First, usually there's music at the Van Hasselt Lecture. Music that fits to the lecture and brings joy to the audience. Unfortunately, the musician had to cancel this evening. Second, there is a brief overview of an art initiative by 3 members of the foundation of the Student Strike. And those are Dick van Ginhoven, chair and initiator, also former board member of the Gezelschap Praktische Studie. Ties Brink, vice chair, also president of the Senate of the Delft Studentenkoor. And Anna Zinitsky, secretary, also a board member of the Jewish Student Association Delft. And I want to ask you to come forward and tell something about the Foundation Student Strike, de Stichting Delftse Studentenstaking november 1940.
So many unspoken memories still haunt my head in small details, so much that I still go to write them down. Telling it, as it turns out after many years, is not really possible. After his return from Buchenwald, Bart van der Pot did not exchange any word about his experiences during his arrest and his subsequent imprisonment in Scheveningen, Amersfoort, Buchenwald and Ravensbrück. Not even with his wife, brother or sister. Apparently that was not possible. The fact that 30 years later, in 1972, a year before his death, he decided to write it down, his memories, After all, it indicates that he still wanted them to be preserved and read. His wife later said that in that period he went upstairs in the evening and that she heard the ticking of the typewriter without knowing what he was writing about. Bart van der Pot, dames en heren, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the 3,000 students who went on strike nearly 85 years. Actually, next week, 25 and 6 November, it's 85 years ago. He was one of the 3,000 students. And he was a buddy, he was a very good friend of Frans van Hasselt. Bart came back from Buchenwald. Frans did not. Bart writes about living in a concentration camp with Frans van Hasselt, which we honor now with the lecture this evening. Also, I must say, together with Frans van Hasselt and 93 others, Bart van der Pot was picked up after the murder on Hugo de Man. And Hugo de Man was the traitor who was responsible for the imprisonment and the traiting the group Mekel, Professor Mekel and Professor Schumacher. They were all sent to prison, and Frans van Hasselt and Bart van der Pot were with them. Bart survived the hell of Buchenwald. Frans van Hasselt did not. By the way, my name is Dick van Ginhoven, and we stepped up a foundation to honor the student strike and keep the memory alive. And we want to raise a piece of art, a standbeeld, kunstwerk, in the city of Delft to have good memory of this particular period in Delft.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thies Brink, and I am now the president of the Senate of Delft Studentenkoor and also the vice chair of the foundation Stichting Delftse Studentenstaking November 1940. Like said before, this Sunday it is exactly 85 years ago since Frans van Hasselt, who was also part of the Senate of the Delft Studentenkoor, gave his famous speech that led to the student strike. In November 1940, months after the German occupation began, the students from Delft saw something intolerable. Their Jewish professors and fellow students were expelled, and they chose not to look away. It became the first open strike in the Netherlands against the Nazis, an act of moral resistance. And those students had nothing to gain. The university board was against them, and they knew the risks. Arrests, closure of the university, and even death could follow. Yet they chose courage over fear, justice over convenience, and solidarity over silence. And the strike was short and non-violent, but its meaning was great. It showed that resistance was possible, and it gave a first clear sign of solidarity with their fellow human beings, inspiring later acts of resistance. And 85 years later, their choice still speaks to us. Freedom and justice should not be taken for granted. And courage does not begin with heroic deeds, but with the simple sentence, "This is wrong." And as students of today, we stand with their tradition. And with our foundation, we want to keep this story alive. Not as a story in a book, but as an assignment to every new generation of students in Delft. When you see injustice, do not remain silent. Thank you.
Thanks, Thies. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna. I'm the vice president of the Jewish Student Association in Delft and also the secretary of this foundation, Delft Student Strike 1940. And it's a privilege to be here today. I want to say that when we remember the Delft Student Strike in November of 1940, we recall a moment when young people chose moral clarity over silence. And when their Jewish fellow students and professors were expelled, they stopped their work, not for a political gain, but just out of conviction. They risked, as Thies said, their safety to defend the dignity not of themselves, but of others. And this was the first public protest against the Nazi regime, and it's still a powerful reminder to us today that injustice can never be met with indifference. That's a very relevant topic in today's world. And of course, as a representative of the Jewish community, I feel profound gratitude to Frans van Hasselt and the other students who stood up for their Jewish colleagues. In a time of fear and exclusion, they saw people and not categories. And their solidarity continues to inspire us today, 85 years later. And it reminds us that freedom and justice can't be taken for granted, even today. And their message still speaks to us, because we live in an age of, although extraordinary technological progress, but at the same time, a growing polarization, disinformation, prejudice, discrimination, nationalism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and generally the erosion of information in public life. So once again, truth, empathy, and human dignity are a bit under pressure. And in these times, the example set by the student strike is deeply relevant. They saw every human being as worthy of respect, regardless of origin or belief. Their courage, then, calls on us to do the same, to speak out when we see injustice, and to ensure that, as members of the TU, that our knowledge and science always serve humanity and ethical responsibility. Their example urges us to use our education and our privilege to build a world where courage and compassion are inseparable. So let us, as students, as citizens, as members of the community, continue to honor this legacy, not only through remembrance, but more importantly, through our actions of compassion and courage. So today, our foundation begins actually its crowdfunding campaign to commission an artwork, as Dick mentioned, in the center of Delft. This is to commemorate the brave students of 1940. And those interested, after the program today, you can find the brochure at the exit with more information about what we do in the work of our foundation, and also a link to our website where you can find out more. So thank you for giving us a moment, and let us now give our attention to Dr. Michael Klink.
I'll take the microphone now. Thank you so much. Now let's move to the next part. In a few moments, Michael Klink will be introducing our esteemed Van Hasselt lecturer, Professor Lisa Herzog, who will be talking about AI and the future of work. Artificial intelligence, another controversial subject. At TU Delft, we develop AI and we work with it. We know its many uses and advantages, from medical breakthroughs to the speeding up of design processes. But AI raises many questions as well about bias and fairness and privacy and data protection, but also about creativity and original thought, and ultimately about who we are as human beings. So I, for one, am very much looking forward toward this lecture and to the rest of the evening. Thank you. And the floor is to Michael Klink.
Thank you, Hans. Dear colleagues, dear students, dear guests, my name is Michael Klink, and it's my pleasure and great honor to welcome you here to the Van Hasselt Lecture of 2025 on behalf of TPM and Studium Generale. I also especially welcome the Council General of Turkey amongst our guests here today, as we quite literally give center stage to the ideas of and the enduring importance of Frans van Hasselt. We commemorate at TU Delft Frans van Hasselt and his deeds since 2015, and we do so by bringing the world's leading moral philosophers to Delft. to join us in reflecting on Van Hasselt's legacy and the importance of moral values in today's technological world. And this is not only a remembrance, this is a public commitment. Here at Delft, as Hans said, we aim to educate excellent engineers on the one hand, but not only that. We aim to educate citizens who hold a broad, encompassing and accurate view of their moral responsibility, and who can cultivate a moral sensitivity to do what's right and good. Because recognizing your responsibility and acting on it, that is no easy task. When we today remember what Frans van Hasselt did, and when we memorize and look at his courage, we benefit from hindsight. We know that the good and the right that he stood for ultimately prevailed. And arguably, perhaps it was worth paying the ultimate price that he paid. But I imagine that things did not feel glorious when Frans van Hasselt's time came to act. It is terrifying to stand up against power. I imagine it's horrible to be pursued, horrible to be caught, horrible to be made to suffer and to be denied help by the hands of fellow human beings who could provide the help. And when I think about this lecture and prepare it, I wonder if I could muster the courage to do what Frans van Hasselt did. Would you? Life is already full of shoulds and musts, and it can often feel overwhelming, I think. There are our very personal commitments, our responsibilities to our family, our job, our personal projects. And there on the other side, there are the needs of society, and I think we all see plenty that needs correction. We heard about some of that today. Hatred, dissociation, war, poverty, carelessness. It can all be a bit much. And perhaps it's no surprise then that today's best-selling books, they tell us to let them. Mind our own business. They teach us the subtle art of not giving a fuck. And our society seems to crave these messages, these battle cries for letting go. They might have their place, I think, but they cannot be the full story to a life lived well. And there's no easy solution, I fear. Nothing that I know of that rids you and me from the challenge to do more. Sorry, but at a loss for a solution to that problem and to that kind of feeling the pulse of two directions, I think there's no solution that makes the problem disappear, but we can perhaps take a philosophical look, a shift in perspective, and look at this problem from a different angle. We can remind ourselves that the very possibility of acting, that is a blessing. Eddie Jaco was a prisoner at Buchenwald too, like Van Hasselt, but Jaco survived, and he later wrote a book, and he called himself in the book the happiest man on earth. How can that be, with all that he saw and suffered through? He said this is because he was alive. He was alive to act, to make decisions, and to bear responsibility. And that wonderful possibility that we can act and bear this responsibility is, I hope, something that we can learn to cherish. And that relates to one of the reasons that this lecture exists, to foster the ideas and inspirations that we need to act when our time has come. Now, let me now take you a bit closer to the topic of today's lecture and make a slight shift towards that topic by focusing on the value of being able to act. Before our lecture, as Hans said, we usually have music, and today our musician would have interacted, shown us a positive vision of what it is to act together with machines, to act together with an AI. And that positive vision would have been how acting together with technology could enhance human agency, make that value that we have of acting freely even more valuable and beautiful, perhaps. So sadly, she cannot be here today. She has fallen ill, and the technology that she developed crucially works together with her. It still depends on her. It doesn't replace her yet completely. So we have to do without music today. But we can go straight to the lecture. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Lisa Herzog, our 8th honorary lecturer of the Frans van Hasselt Lecture. Professor Herzog is the Aletta Jacobs Chair of Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the University of Groningen, where she taught since 2019. She received her diploma in economics from LMU Munich in 2007 and her doctorate in political theory from Oxford University in 2011. Professor Herzog received numerous honors, awards and prizes in her already very distinguished career. She's a member of the Jonge Academie, of the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities, and of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has won numerous prizes and held fellowships at, amongst others, Leuven, Utrecht, and Oxford. Her main research has been at the intersection of economics and philosophy, where she focused on questions about the philosophical dimensions of markets, such as the conditions under which markets are legitimate, the conditions under which we should have markets and allow free trade in markets in the first place. She's widely recognized as a leading voice on workplace democracy, professional ethics, and the future of work in digital societies. One core theme of her work focuses on the inherent political and moral dimension of the economy. So some want to make us believe that the economy is a value-neutral institution and any interference in the economy might have bad consequences, but it's inherently wrong. It's the wrong thing to interfere morally in this value-neutral institution. That's misguided ideology. But Herzog shows that this is not so. There is no value-neutral institution to begin with. The economy and how we structure it, how we give rules to markets, for example, is inherently political to begin with. And so we better choose wisely. We carefully consider our action in structuring the economy so that it best benefits society and all of its members. And another of her notable contributions concerns the very value of work, so one particular area in which we can act. According to Herzog, work is not merely, it is that as well, but not only a way to earn a wage and exchange goods. Its evaluative profile is much richer. It includes the value of participation, of contribution, of doing something together. And seeing work in this broader way also reshapes how we think and should think about the prospect of automation. Because once we realize that there are values in work beyond this exchange character, the prospect of replacing human work with machines takes a far more existential hue. That reminds us of what's really valuable. And her account of the value of work also exemplifies a very distinct way of doing philosophy, which is also why we invited her here today. She's incredibly inventive, interdisciplinary, and excellent by all standards of philosophy. And at the same time, deeply engaged with society. And you might almost want to say, despite her academic work. But that, I think, presupposes a false dichotomy between academic rigor and excellence and professional and citizen responsibility. Her prolific body of work shows how the two can really strengthen one another. So she mentors the next generation, contributes to public reflection, for example today, and actively shapes the discourse on how we want our economies and institutions to be shaped. She is in those ways a role model, and her work is a treasure of innovative and fruitful ideas. So if the possibility of acting is a gift, then I think Professor Herzog is someone who embraces that gift with seriousness and care. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Lisa Herzog to deliver the 2025 Van Hasselt Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here today with you to honor Frans van Hasselt's Moral Courage. I'm originally from Germany. It's very painful for me to remember these times. And I've been in the Netherlands for 6 years, and I've always been very warmly welcomed. So thank you for allowing me to give this lecture. I want to talk about one area where I think moral dilemmas, moral decisions are going to come our way in the future. They are already there to some extent. And as was mentioned, this is AI. In the last Kursbuch, which is a kind of philosophical magazine that appears in Germany every 3 months, the artist and filmmaker Hito Steyerl was asked, together with many other people, can you be replaced by AI? Other contributors wrote long essays. Steyerl gave a one-sentence answer. Yes, but why? Now, Hito Steyerl, she's an artist who does interesting and inspiring work. She can practice her skills, she can express her views, she can put her personality into her work. So if you want to use this term homo creans, the creative human being that interacts with their surroundings, that is an example. Her work is also well paid. In today's art market, you need to be a brand, and she is a brand. If the same work was done by someone without a name, maybe it would not carry that much monetary value, but she is one of them. So indeed, why should she be replaced by AI? This is another work of art that I recently came across in the Museum for Applied Art in Vienna. It's called Post Laboratory, and it's meant to address, quote, the rapidly increasing automation of work by robots and artificial intelligence and the elimination of human labor linked to it. Now, I'm not quite sure what exactly it's meant to represent, but it seems to have something to do with cleaning, housework, the kind of unseen, unappreciated routine work that often gets done in households by women, sometimes gets outsourced to other women in the labor market, tends to be underpaid. And unfortunately, no such omnipotent cleaning machine seems to be out there available for us. Feminist philosophers and economists have remarked that there seems to be something a bit misguided in how we use AI for what kind of work that gets replaced. And to quote Helen Hester and Nick Sniczek, they write, somewhat perversely, the more enjoyable aspects of childcare, engaging, playing, interacting with children, have been automated via screens, while the more routine and burdensome aspects have remained largely untouched. So I want to talk about AI and the future of work, and I want to focus in on a discussion that seems to be often missing, namely, not the happy users that can have fun chatting with AI, but the workers who work under AI. And by working under AI, I mean being managed by AI in various ways. And I want to distinguish that from two other dimensions of work that are often forgotten, but that I will not talk about today. For one thing, you have the workers that you could call the workers behind AI. So, for example, the annotators, who need to classify content, pictures, videos, sort out the stuff that contains child pornography, for example. That is often very gruesome work, and it's outsourced to other parts of the world, unseen by Western users. And there are also those workers who maintain the technical infrastructure. So, for example, many of us use the internet and maybe AI agents on our phones, but we, or I should say I at least, rarely think about all that it takes in terms of material infrastructure to make sure that you have coverage everywhere you go. So all the radio towers that need to be built and maintained. And the American labor law scholar David Weil discusses this example of work it's an area where a lot of work is fissured, and that's a term that I would like you to please remember. I'll come back to this. So it gets outsourced, and then often gets outsourced even further. So you have subcontractors, and at the end of the chain, you often have independent workers who have the lowest bargaining power of everyone in this chain, and who work at very bad conditions. They have to pay for their own safety equipment. There can be many near accidents if the work is not really well coordinated. And interestingly, in the US, that's a book about the US that David Weld wrote, that's the kind of work that happens in the background to maintain all these radio towers for us to have internet connection and thereby also AI access on our phones. So that's all there, and I want to acknowledge it, but my focus will be on those working under AI. The term algorithmic management gets used more and more, and there's a lot of focus on so-called platform workers. I'll also talk about those. So those who work on online platforms, Uber drivers, delivery riders, and so on. But the assumption in a lot of the literature is that techniques of algorithmic management will also be applied to far more white-collar jobs in banks, in schools, in insurance companies. And we'll see how it will really play out. I don't have a glass ball either. But I think it's really important to think about what this will mean for the workers being algorithmically managed. And of course, that question comes on top and is often intertangled with many other ethical questions about AI. Hans mentioned a few: privacy, or the end of privacy, biases. If the data sets that were used to train AI, as is well known, if they are biased, you also get biased outcomes in algorithms. You can take the care to unbias them if you want to, but that costs money, and who's willing to pay for that? And reliability. What if the AI confabulates? What can we really entrust to AI, and where is human oversight unavoidable? All of these things are also very important ethical issues, but I want to focus in particular on the experience and the meaning of work. And to explain a bit the political economy behind this, I want to contrast two ways in which to think about firms as value-creating organizations. So when we go to work, we enter work organizations. Very few of us work completely independently. Typically, we work together with others, we have colleagues. You could say that's a kind of life world experience of doing something together. And the idea is that we do this together in companies or organizations because the costs of doing this in markets would be too high. That's the famous distinction by Ronald Coase that was introduced already in the 1930s. Some things are more efficiently done in markets, but many other things are more efficiently done in what he called hierarchies, so integrated structures where we have clear roles, clear responsibilities, you have different units, and that allows you to reap efficiencies that are different from those in markets, and I mean economies of scale or the complementarities of different people working together. Now, already Adam Smith and many other early economists argued that there is this advantage of people working together that comes from the division of labor. In the Encyclopédie of the Enlightenment, it was the pin factory as an example, which Adam Smith then stole from the early encyclopedists. And he describes how dividing work can lead to a manifold increase in productivity. If you have one person trying to make a pin, you make a dozen over a day. If you have 10 people working together, they can make thousands of pins. That's still very much the idea of efficiency in work organizations. But that basic principle can be compatible with the idea that it's really a work community. You might rotate the jobs. You might work together by deciding together what you do. Whether you do that or not is a practical question, but in principle, all employees in such an imaginary of the firm understand why they are collaborating and what they are doing together. And because there can be conflicts, you need some kind of coordination function. That's what we call management. But in my view, at least, I think this management function should be very much in the service of the actual work that gets done. That's, if you like, a very old-fashioned, maybe to some extent a European, and in any case a non-economist view of what firms are. Another view of firms is that they are basically sets of assets that employ people in order to create value for shareholders. And the orientation is first and foremost to the customers, because that's where the money sits, insofar as the customers are ones that have money. That's another issue. If you have customers without purchasing power, then your company will not serve them. But in order to then also choose how to distribute the money you make, mostly American, to some extent British economists have come up with this idea that shareholders are the ones who carry the so-called residual risk of a company, and therefore the companies should be oriented towards shareholder maximization. That's well known by now. But what I want to point out is that in that perspective, workers are seen really only as contractors with these entities that look two ways, as it were, towards the customers and towards the shareholders, and the humans who work there are a cost factor, an input factor into the production function. Does it mean that workers get automatically treated very badly? No, not necessarily, because it can be efficient and profitable if you treat them better, as some companies do if they have highly skilled laborers that might leave. But often, it's not the most efficient way to treat your workers well. And what kind of working conditions people get then depends completely on their bargaining power in the market situation. And there's often a lot of hypocrisy in that kind of corporate environment, in the sense that companies try to create a picture of a community of people working together towards a shared purpose, because that's how human motivation often functions. But actually, if the view of the company is directed towards customers and shareholders, then ultimately employees tend to look through this model and understand that they are ultimately just a cost factor. Now, how might work change under AI management? In the happy community picture, you could say, well, workers together can decide how they want to use AI, they can see what works, what doesn't, they can take decisions about this. But if you have a picture or a legal and social reality of companies where workers are a cost factor, then you might get a very different use of AI that doesn't really care about the quality of work and what it's like to be algorithmically managed at all. And note that we in Europe, we take it for granted that there are things like ondernemingsraden, so employee representation, that have a bit of a say in what companies do. That's not the case in many other countries. So I want to explore how work might change under AI management. And I mean, Michael gave away that part of my talk, so I can be very quick here. From an economic perspective, the main question is, what is the financial value of work and how can it be maybe increased through AI use? But from a philosophical perspective, I want to also include other dimensions here. And I've structured this along 4 axes, but I'm not claiming they are the only ones, there might be others. But I want to reflect on the pedagogical value, the community value, the meaning of work, and the political dimensions of work. And just briefly, if you think about this from an economic perspective, you might think of these things as positive or negative spillovers or externalities, so things that are not priced, but that might still have a value for society, but for companies it doesn't appear in their balance sheet how these effects work out. So let me run through these 4 axes. The pedagogical value of work. Obviously, this is something that comes a lot up in schools and universities at the moment. how can students first learn what they need to know in order to then cleverly and competently use AI? And what exactly do they need to use? And what do they need to understand first? In many jobs, you have similar developments. And I'm not saying that all of this is negative, but there is already some empirical research that indicates that the use of AI can also de-skill people, in the sense that if you rely on the AI, you lose your own skill. There was a famous study on endoscopists that went through the media, who were supported by an AI tool, and then when the AI tool was taken away from them, they were much less likely to discover polyps. It's about internal medicine. I don't know anything about the details here. But they lost, or their skills were reduced because they relied on a tool. And of course you can ask, is that a bad thing per se? Does this matter? But if you don't do things yourself anymore, then often your skills will decline over time. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that we unlearn if we use AI in our work? Does it matter? Does it matter if we then also lose these skills for our private lives, for our civic life maybe? And what might happen if, say, there is a natural disaster and the AI infrastructure breaks down for some time? What skills that we would then still need might we have sort of lost because we've trusted the AI all the time? I mean, I'm also a victim of Google Maps, but navigating without digital guidance is a skill that lots of people have apparently not practiced for a long time. And we might even ask, well, what skills are such that it might actually be valuable in themselves for people to have these skills? The sheer enjoyment of being good at something and getting better as you work. There's a very nice book on work motivation by Dan Pink called Drive, which summarizes a lot of empirical work on what motivates people to do good work. And mastery is one of the big categories of what motivates people intrinsically. So wanting to get better at something, wanting to master certain skills, that can be a real pleasure and a way of flourishing at work. But you can't do this if the AI does it for you. Is that worth keeping or not? I think that's one of the questions here. Now, the second axis I want to discuss is the community value of work. Work has often been a place of social inclusion, and we have this word, the colleague, as the term for someone that one works with. And many people make this joke that they spend more time with their office colleague than with their partner at home. Maybe we should reduce work time, but that's another issue. But there is something specific about working together in a certain field, and especially if you are in a very specialized area that requires a lot of technical skills, your colleagues are often the ones who can really judge how good your work actually is. If you tell your husband or wife at home, oh, I did a great job today, and they work in a completely different line of work, how can they seriously tell you, yes, you did a good job? If they are honest with you, they'll probably say, yeah, well, I can't tell. You need to ask a colleague whether you really did a good job here. Now, colleagues are, in many workplaces, those who know how things really work and who need to socialize newcomers into jobs. And here, I think I'll not go too deep into the philosophical background here, but there's a very interesting discussion here that matters for understanding why that is. You might say a newcomer to a job should just read the rule books. Every organization has lots of books and documents and strategies, and they all say what's supposed to happen. Of course, people don't do this because the lived reality is always quite different. And in philosophy, Wittgenstein has a famous discussion about what it means to follow a rule. And he starts with some very funny examples about a pupil, a young kid that learns to count. And when they get to 994, 996, 998, 1000, the kid continues 1004, 1008, See what I mean? 1012. Teacher says, sorry, you're making a mistake here. You need to continue 1002 and 1004, and so on. And the kid says, yeah, but I thought when I move beyond 1000, that's how the rule continues. Now, this may be a very extreme example, but what Wittgenstein wants to express here is that rule following requires a background of a shared practice so that you can know what it means to go on with a certain rule. And one of the challenges in many workplaces is that we have rules, but reality is always changing. So how do we apply the rules to new cases? And that is one of the reasons for why one might want to work together in organizations in the first place, that together you can create that kind of culture that helps you to understand what it means to go on. Now, one of the challenges here is that big data might actually be used to incorporate many forms of this background knowledge by tracking what people have done in the past. And I've read about an example of a company trying to actually develop an onboarding AI so that new colleagues would no longer have to read the books or ask a colleague, but have a chatbot that would tell them, well, this is how people really did it in the past. And this possibility of using big data and AI for expressing the lived rules of workplaces is, I think, a very interesting phenomenon when it comes to how work is organized. I talked earlier about this phenomenon of fissuring work, of subcontracting and breaking big companies into smaller companies and then having further subcontractors and so on. And this depends to a great extent on digital technologies. And the big risk is, or risk from my perspective, because I think there's something that gets lost here, is that with AI that incorporates the rules of workplaces, you lower the costs of fissuring even more. So you don't need collegiality anymore. You can have the rules embodied in programs. And then you might get a kind of division of workplaces into two types. And in a recent paper, I've called one type villages and the other protocols. And the idea is this. In villages, that's the kind of workplaces where you still have a community that gives itself its own rules and interprets these rules and applies them to new cases and has its own culture and its way of doing that. But protocol jobs are the ones where everything actually follows a protocol that doesn't give the worker a lot of autonomy in what they do, and that makes it unnecessary to discuss with others how you should actually deal with specific cases. Work in call centers has already quite a few of these features. You don't learn from your colleagues how to do the calls in a call center. You get a script. And I've read that AI is already recording people's voices and analyzing how well they are following the protocol and whether they are friendly enough in their tone. And it tells people if they are not sounding nice enough to customers, and then it nudges them, you have to change your tone of voice. Now, maybe that's efficient, but it completely changes the experience of what it means to work together with others. It's you and the machine, and all the knowledge, the experiences, the rule following that in the past often had to be situated in the community of a workplace can then get protocolized in an AI. So you might get many forms of work that get far lonelier than they are today. And given that the World Health Organization has already declared loneliness a global pandemic, there's a real question about what this will mean for people's work experience. Now, speaking of the work experience, I want to move to the meaning of work. And this is actually an AI fail when I try to produce an illustration for this part of my lecture, and I'll tell you what it is about. So, again, I want to delve briefly into one philosophical area in order to make this point. And the area is this. The meaning of human action can be described at different levels. And Elizabeth Anscombe has used a famous example, and that's what I tried to get the AI to put on a picture here, and I failed. And the example goes like this. There's a man who moves his arm, thereby pumping water, thereby bringing a poisonous liquid into the water supply of a house, thereby poisoning the inhabitants of this house, thereby overthrowing a regime, thereby securing world peace. Now, you see the point? Moving one's arm is only one level of description of what's going on here. The deeper meaning of what's going on is that this person, in this example, is trying to change something on the political level. And many forms of human action have the structure. We can describe them at a very low level as some kind of bodily movement, or we can describe them as part of a greater connection between things that really has some higher value at its aim. And here is anecdotally an experience that I had when I myself was, fortunately, a very short time subjected to algorithmic management. So this is anecdotal, but I think there is something going on there. So I had to do page proofs. That's a typical thing that academics have to do. You publish something, you get a last version of it. And in the past, this felt for me like something, okay, I have a last opportunity to really look at this text, make sure everything sounds good, make sure there are no typos anymore, and it's me taking responsibility for this text before I send it out into the world, as it were. So this is a very idealistic, high-level description, you could say, of what I'm doing. Now, a while ago, I had to use an online program by an academic publishing house in order to do my proofs. And I think they must have used AI because it was so stupid it can't have been done by a human being. So it gave me lots of tasks, and I had to do lots of steps, and they were not, you couldn't do them. They asked me to put stuff into fields that were already somewhere else in the text. So it was all very nonsensical. But in any case, all these tasks focused my attention very much on a very low-level way of describing what I was doing. I was trying to get that stupid system to accept the change of a reference, instead of, I'm contributing to a beautiful text. Now, I'm not saying that you couldn't also program AI differently, but in this case, the AI had apparently been programmed such that it had a strange idea that you need to have very clear instructions for very low-key steps in the process. So in terms of the Anscombe example, it would be very much about just please move your arm this way and not another way, and not contribute to world peace. And I got so fascinated by this that I searched around a little bit, and I found an empirical theory that built on Anscombe's account, namely, it's called action identification theory. It's a psychological theory from the 1980s, which used experiments to understand at what level human beings describe their own work or their own actions. And they used various experiments and explored various claims. And one of them, which is relevant here, is that people typically have a certain description of their action in mind that they use to guide their behavior. And they focus on this until they get interrupted by something, and then they would often focus on a lower level, more concrete level of description of what they are doing. So when you get interrupted, when you cannot remain in the flow of the higher level description and your self-understanding of what you're doing, you switch to something that is at a lower level of description. They had very funny experiments. They gave people tea to drink in very unhandy cups, and then they asked them what they were doing, and compared to people drinking tea from normal cups, the people who had more trouble doing it described it more as I'm moving my hand, I'm trying to get this cup to my mouth, and so on. So it really kept you down at the low level of description. Now, what I'm trying to say, or the question I want to raise here is, how does AI supported or AI managed work do this? Does it allow people to see their actions at a higher level of description, where they can be connected to meaning, to value, to what this work means for others maybe? Or does it control them at this level of nitty-gritty detail that brings their attention constantly down to something that is really very menial and doesn't let them see the bigger meaning of what they're doing? I think, as I said, it's not a matter of, you could probably use AI in both ways, but the question is that what the workers will get? And who has a say on the level of description at which AI supports your work? Let me now move to the fourth axis, and in a way, that's maybe the most important one. So the political dimension of work. Historically, work has often been a place where political action started, especially, of course, for members of the working class. Unions recruited people at work, people recruited each other, and many socialist and social democratic parties really worked from the ground up with workers who, even for just pragmatic reasons, often had to live together. I mean, before the time of public transport and cars, they often lived very close to where they worked. They were very dependent on each other, and that was, to a great extent, the breeding ground for political action and for raising an awareness of, well, what is our position, how do we relate to others in society, and so on. Now, recently I worked with a sociologist from Argentina, Agustin Presti-Filippo, on the work experience of delivery riders. Most of them were cyclists, but a few were on motorcycles as well, about how they understand their own work. He did interviews with them in Buenos Aires, and we analyzed them together. And there were lots of interesting aspects there. They liked the flexibility. They liked that they could combine this work with other activities, studying, or one wanted to become an actor and found it great that he has the flexibility to go to auditions. So it was not all negative. But there was one really interesting aspect that we discussed, and that was that they had a really depoliticized understanding of themselves and their role in their work. In delivery work, you have no direct colleagues. It's the customers, the restaurants, and then those who receive the meals. And there are some WhatsApp groups where people communicate with each other, but there's no space where they could gather. They hang out together in public spaces. You see this also in lots of other cities. And they also had a very individualized attitude. They saw this as a kind of sports race almost, where they had to be fast, they had to be disciplined, and they saw the app very much as a kind of opponent that they needed to conquer. So it was very much we individually racing against the machine. And their emotions when something went wrong, that was very interesting. Those were directed mostly at other human beings. They were angry with customers who made them wait, because it's a human reaction. If someone doesn't treat you with respect or doesn't treat you fairly, you have an emotional reaction. But the machine, the app in the background that made them work under these conditions, they treated this not as something you'd be angry against, but almost as a kind of naturalized phenomenon, almost like bad weather. Yeah, the app is this way, you cannot negotiate with it. There were no human beings involved. There was a call center they could call, but they had to wait for hours, and that usually didn't resolve things. So they started not to negotiate or talk, but to rather game the app. So many of them had several accounts. If they got blocked in one, they would use another. And they had very clever ways of influencing what kind of task they would get. But it was always a strategic attitude. And it made them very much, the mindset they described was really very much, I'm on my own, there's this machine out there that gives me an opportunity to earn money, but there's no one with whom I could do this together, and I need to be strategic and clever in how I can use this machine for my purposes. Now, you might say maybe that's not very representative. There were lots of young migrants there from Venezuela who had very negative views of anything they would describe as vaguely socialist. But generally speaking, there's something really interesting in how algorithmic management can divide people. And I mean, you don't need to be a Marxist or a socialist, but this very idea that people have joint interests, maybe something like class consciousness, it's very difficult to imagine how that can arise in algorithmically managed work if people are so much against each other. And it's a kind of divide and conquer strategy in a way. And the same holds also for many things that are not only AI mediated, but also done online. So the worldwide ghost work that happens on platforms, Amazon Turk and so on. What's fascinating is that people still look for each other. And they still connect in some online spaces. Some of them say hello to each other before they start their working day, even though they never meet each other in person. So the human ability to try to build contact to others who do similar work, that seems to be a very deep-rooted drive, but it cannot really become politically active in the way in which historically the community at work has often been politically relevant. Now, I've been sort of negative here, and that's a deliberate strategy, because I think we need to think about the risks so that we can prevent them and think about what's at stake. What do we want to choose? But I also want to mention some positives. One is that, well, if we really get increased productivity, could we reduce work time? And I think it's no accident that this fight is a little bit coming back. I mean, it was a century-long thing that the working class has fought for work time reduction. I think it's no coincidence that it's back on the agenda. The 4-day work week is currently being discussed. And there could also be much more flexibility in terms of where we work, with whom we work. One thing that I find particularly interesting is that there might also be AI-facilitated opportunities to change direction later in life, not to be stuck in one career, one area of education, because AI might help detect skills that people have that might allow them to get into new forms of work without official credentials, without university degrees, for example. Not saying that university degrees will become superfluous, but in software programming, it's apparently already the case that with the help of AI tools, people can be recruited into jobs on the basis of their contributions to online forums and websites and so on. And that has apparently had a very positive effect on equality of opportunity in this area. But what I really want to emphasize is that all these developments leave us with decisions to make. Michael emphasized the importance of acting, and acting with algorithms and robots and AIs is certainly important, but there's also the collective and political action that matters here. And I think we have choices to make about how we want to use AI. What do we do if, for some lines of work, it might be more beneficial for the recipients, the patients, the students, if we use AI, but it completely hollows out the experience, the skills, and so on, of those who provide this work. Whose interests should we weigh in what ways? How do we do this? And how do we prevent a scenario where, for some, AI makes work better and more productive and more pleasurable and maybe even leaves them more free time, whereas for others, all the negative sides come together? So my plea here really is, and also something that Michael sort of gave away, we need to think here about work not as something that only matters from an economic perspective, but also as a matter of how we want to live together and what kind of working conditions do we impose on whom, and how do we deal with all these trade-offs that we'll have to make. And my wish would be that in an AI-based future of work, everyone can have a package of tasks and maybe more free time as well, where they could give the answer that Hito Steyerl gave. Maybe I could be replaced, but why? Thank you very much.
Yes. Dann ich gebe dir noch die. Ja. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Herzog. Thank you for contributing to our evening tonight. And as a small sign of our appreciation, I present you with the Van Hasselt Commemorative Medal that all our speakers receive. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön. Danke.
Yeah, let's move on to the Makel Prize 2025. We live in an age defined by crisis, moments that challenge not only our scientific and technological capabilities, but also our humanity and sense of responsibility. Natural disasters are no longer distant headlines. They strike communities with increasing frequency and intensity. And in those moments, the true value of science is not measured by precision or innovation alone, but by its ability to heal, to rebuild, and to reconnect. Tonight we celebrate a project that embodies that spirit from core to home, created by Laila van der Waarde, Meric Kessaf, Job Schroen, and the architectural recovery team. Following the devastating earthquakes in Turkey in 2023, and I would like to see how many remember that earthquake. Yeah, if I talk about it. Following the devastating earthquakes in Turkey in 2023, countless rural and low-income families in Hatay were left behind, living in temporary shelters with poor sanitary conditions and no long-term perspective. While national recovery efforts focused on large urban reconstruction, this team turns its attention to those most in need, developing a community-led, sustainable and dignified approach to rebuilding homes and lives. Their concept is as elegant as it is powerful, a prefabricated core unit providing the essentials, a kitchen, bathroom and technical systems, offering immediate safety, hygiene and dignity. Around these solid foundations, families can gradually expand and personalize their homes with locally built wooden modules. In doing so, they reclaim autonomy, preserve cultural traditions, and ensure resilience against future seismic risks. Developed at TU Delft in close collaboration with local municipalities, NGOs and construction firms, this project bridges academic research, value-driven design and real-world impact. What began as a student initiative culminated in a built prototype in Hatay, completed in June 2025, is today inhabited by a family of 7. This achievement proves that academic knowledge and local craftsmanship can come together to create lasting, socially responsible solutions in times of crisis. Inclusivity and transparency guided this project from the start. The team, comprising members from Turkey, Syria, France and the Netherlands, worked hand in hand with the local family, co-designing every element from spatial layout to material choice. Each decision reflects real needs and lived experience. The result is more than a shelter. It is a home that restores social fabric, reinforces trust, and nurtures mental well-being after displacement. With From Core to Home, the architectural recovery team offers a replicable model for disaster recovery, one that combines sustainability, respect for cultural identity, and social empowerment. Their work reminds us that design and engineering, at their best, serve humanity. We are proud of these exemplary students and colleagues who show us that technical excellence gains true meaning only when it is guided by empathy and ethical responsibility. It is with great honor that we congratulate Laila van der Waarde, Merit Kessaf, Job Schroen, and the Architectural Recovery Team as the deserving winners of the 2025 Mekel Prize. The contributions of Elif Selen and Hatice Gürgüoglu, that's a hard one, have been equally indispensable to the success of the project. We therefore ask all of them now to come on stage to receive the prize and take a picture with us. Ja. Ja. Please come on the stage. Yeah. Yeah, I'll also put it here. Congratulations. 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 Yeah, a real congratulations, congratulations. Who's the strongest of you? This is heavy. Yeah? No. So, yeah, let's stand in the middle and make a picture together. So if you go a little bit, yeah. Excellent, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, shall I give this? Oh, you? Yeah. Yeah. You can take it with you. Yeah. Yeah, take it back. Okay, we have now come to an end. Almost 4 decades ago, a master supervisor at Delft University asked me to write a master thesis on artificial intelligence. And then later on he asked me, can you also write a PhD? And then the rest of my life I worked in AI. And now and then I get letters from people that ask me, why did you waste all your life? Or why are you ruining our lives? Do you know what is happening? And sometimes it's a long letter, and I take it very seriously and I start a discussion. But it makes me think. People have a different view of what we probably are doing. Thank you, Lisa Herzog, for the very nice lecture and also for talking about effects of AI in human lives. Thank you, Michael Klenk, for preparing everything, for your introduction also, and for the very good introduction, the introduction that you gave here. Thank you, Dick van Ginhoven, Ties Brink, and Anna Zitnitsky, for the foundation you started, and hopefully many people here will contribute to this initiative, and we will see a nice artwork in the center of Delft. And then thank you all for being here tonight. We will have a drink outside, so one drink is at our costs, and then later on you have to pay yourself if you want to drink more. And hopefully we will have a very pleasant stay here still. Thank you all for being here.